I'm not the smartest guy in the world. I mean, I do pretty okay at school stuff, but I'm not always great at figuring out things that aren't test answers. Normally, it's not a huge deal, but something big happened recently, something huge and messed up. Now I'm really wishing I was the kind of guy who could come up with a plan for this sort of thing. But I'm definitely not. I need serious help. Tom, my old Boy Scout troop leader, said I was all book smarts and no common sense when I burned my hand trying to make a fire at summer camp. I hated Tom, but he may have had a point. I've done some pretty dumb shit over the years. Nothing quite as bad as last summer, though. That remains my stupidest choice of all. It was a couple months after we moved to town for Mom's new job, back when I was still settling into the neighborhood. I'd done a single month of class at my new school before summer break had hit. Being the new kid always sucks. Being the new kid that late in the school year had been brutal. I hadn't managed to make a single friend. I'd barely managed a conversation with more than 2 or 3 people. Mom had insisted I at least go out and get some fresh air. So I was lounging on the porch swing, messing around on my phone. She'd been worried about me since the move. I think she felt bad about it too. We'd moved for her job, and I knew she'd debated even taking it because of me. In the end, it had been too much of a raise to pass up. So we packed up our apartment and moved to a house in a shitty little town 3 states away. I told Mom it was fine, that I'd be leaving for college soon anyway, but I didn't think she really believed me. She'd been watching me closely, slipping me 20s I knew she couldn't actually spare, and just, in general, being way too nice to me for it not to seem like she was feeling guilty. Listen, it did suck. I'd spent my 17th birthday sharing a grocery store ice cream cake with my mom and learning my ex-girlfriend was seeing a new guy through Instagram. It wasn't great, but that wasn't Mom's fault, so I kept telling her it was fine. And going outside to sit on the porch swing when she asked, even though I'd preferred to have been in the air conditioning and on my laptop. I was scrolling through the social media aimlessly when a voice called out to me from the street. I looked up to see several guys from my school standing in front of my house. I'd seen them walking down the street before, but they'd never paid any attention to me. One of them, Danny, lived just a few doors down from me. Danny was in a couple of my classes too. I couldn't remember his last name, but I did remember noticing him a couple times. He was one of those people it was hard not to pay attention to. He was loud, always joking in class and making crude comments or two. But he was somehow well liked by all the teachers. "Hey, new kid," Danny called out, waving at me. "Hey," I said, raising my eyebrows in confusion. Despite our classes together, I'd never actually spoken to Danny or any of his friends that followed him around before. I was pretty sure he hadn't even noticed a new family moving onto his block. Apparently, I was wrong. "What are you doing tonight?" Danny called, one of his friends. Ian something, I knew gave him an odd look for that, but Danny ignored it. Nothing," I said, shifting my legs off the porch swing and sitting up to face him. "Us too. Want to come do nothing with us?" Ian elbowed him. Danny shoved him away, grinning at me. Why?" I asked. "'Cause you're new and I'm friendly and bored as hell. Besides, you gotta hang out with someone, right?" Danny asked. "I guess," I said, remembering how I told you common sense isn't my strong point. But looking back now, this seems even weirder. Danny does. But at the time, it seemed normal enough. I figured he was probably just being friendly to the new kid in town, and I was in pretty desperate need of friends. "So come on, hang out with us," Danny said and shrugged and added, "At least we're going to be doing nothing with beer." 2 of the guys behind him, Noel and Chris, high-fived at that and grinned broadly. I considered my options. I could sit here on my front porch watching Instagram stories and feeling sorry for myself, that I'd left my old friends and life behind, or I could get off my ass and actually have a life here in this town. It wasn't a hard call. "Okay, when and where?" I asked. "Not till dark, but we're gonna go pick up some drinks now. You can come if you want," Danny said, grinning at me broader than ever. He never answered the where part of my question, but I shrugged it off. Names of places around here wouldn't have meant much to me anyway. "Cool." I said, nodding. Let me just tell my mom. I opened the front door. I heard muttering behind me from Danny and his friends. Something whispered and sharp I was sure I wasn't supposed to hear. I shrugged it off. I figured one of the guys just wasn't crazy about a stranger joining them. I figured whoever it was would get over it. I shouted into the house to tell my mom that I was heading out and wouldn't be back until late. She sounded so happy I was actually leaving the porch that she didn't even bother to remind me of my curfew. Back home, me and my friend Jared used to collect cash and give it to his older cousin when we wanted any kind of alcohol. I assumed Danny and his friends had a similar hookup. I wasn't sure why that meant all of us needed to go, but it didn't seem weird enough to question it. I was walking into the back of the group, not really following them, but not quite walking with them either. After a couple of blocks, Ian fell back with me. At first I thought it was because he felt bad that I wasn't with the group, but the way he turned on me changed my mind about that. Look, Ian said, crossing his arms and whispering, you shouldn't come with us. Why? I whispered back. He was still glaring at me, hard enough that I was more than a little unnerved by it. Ian was an intimidating sort of guy, the kind of guy who seemed to spend more time smoking than in class, who somehow already had several tattoos even though we were only 17, who I'd never seen actually say a word to anyone but Danny, who always looked kind of pissed off about everything. Because it's a really, really bad idea. Seriously, go home, Ian said. I frowned. You're probably thinking I should have listened, and you're right, I should have. But I didn't. Part of it was that even I knew Ian had a reputation for being an asshole, so I figured he just didn't like me for whatever reason. Another part of it was that I'd already told my mom I'd be out all night, and I didn't want to just turn around and go home, so I kept walking. I think I can handle drinking with you guys, I said. Ian rolled his eyes at me. That's not the point, he hissed, glancing back up at Danny like he didn't want to be overheard. Then what is it? I asked, crossing my arms. It's just a really bad idea, Ian started. Danny's voice cut over him, interrupting. Ian, are you scaring the new guy off? Danny called over his shoulder. Ian rolled his eyes again. Was just being friendly, like you said, Ian called back. Danny laughed. You're such a shitty liar, dude, he said. Then he turned fully around, walking backward and looking at me. Don't listen to anything he says, all right? He's just trying to ruin my night. I didn't know how to react to that, so I just shrugged. Danny laughed again and turned around before I needed to figure out anything else to say. Ian was frowning beside me. He shoved his hands into his jacket pockets and looked at me again. He started. Then he stopped and shook his head. You really should go home, but if you come, be careful what you tell Danny. What? I asked, totally thrown by that one. Don't tell them anything he doesn't need to know, Ian said. And don't trust him. I was about to question that more, I really was, except we just arrived at a shitty grocery store I'd never been to before. We stopped walking, and Danny stepped back to us and literally grabbed Ian by his arm to pull him away. Danny was saying something about how Ian had both of their fake IDs in his wallet, that I only half heard as they walked away from me. Noel, Chris, and the other guy, Kurt, darted around the alley to the side of the store. I figured I should probably do the same thing, and I followed them. I joined them when they sat on the cement and used the awkward silence that followed to try and figure out what the hell had just happened with Ian. He seemed pretty serious about it, but it was weird. Why would he warn me about becoming friends with someone who he seemed to be his best friend? Why would he tell me not to trust him? It felt strange, like maybe a joke was being played at my expense. Plus, none of the other guys took a chance to warn me about anything, even though they had plenty of time while we waited for Ian and Danny to return. Since no one else seemed concerned, I decided it was probably that Ian was the asshole people said he was, and he just didn't want me hanging out with his friends. Ignoring him felt like the best choice, so I did. Not that he so much as glanced my way when he and Danny stepped back out of the store. We took a different path back, through alleys and past abandoned buildings, so that we wouldn't be seen with the beer Danny and Ian had grabbed. I walked as far away from Ian as I could. I talked to Kurt instead. Well, I tried to talk to Kurt, but he wasn't exactly a big talker. His one-word answers seemed friendly enough, though, and he wasn't glaring at me like Ian had, so I counted it as a win. We walked further on the way back. At first I thought it was just because we were taking a longer route, but the longer we walked, the more I was certain we'd gone past any street that led to my neighborhood. The sun was starting to set by the time we finally stopped outside a small house with a large van in its driveway. The van was brown, covered in rust, and probably older than we were. Danny ran a hand over the hood and grinned back at me. You know, my mom wouldn't let me buy this beauty. She said it was an eyesore and a death trap. Danny said, then he laughed to himself and continued. So I bought it anyway and kept it parked at Uncle Steve's place. Right, I said, nodding. Danny pulled keys out of his pockets and opened the doors. The other guys started climbing in, taking the beer with them and scooted it in onto the floor. Like they were used to this. I hesitated, half because I wasn't sure where I was supposed to sit, and half because the van really did look like a death trap. It's safer than it looks, Noel called, laughing. Don't lie to the new guy like that, Chris said. It was the first thing either of them had said to me, but like Kurt, they seemed friendly enough. I did my best to grin back and laugh with them. Danny stepped up beside me and slung an arm over my shoulder. I don't know why I let them insult my pride and joy like that, Danny said, shaking his head but smiling. Come on, you can sit shotgun, since it's your first time. Thanks, I said, not sure of what else to say. Danny laughed again and yanked open the passenger door. Move, Ian, the new guy's gonna ride with me, Danny said, smirking at Ian. Ian was glaring at me again, but I ignored it. He shook his head as he hopped out of the passenger seat and moved around us. Whatever, he muttered as he climbed into the back. I slid into the front seat, glancing around as Danny got in the driver's side. The van was a mess, littered in bottles, wrappers, cigarette cartons, loose change, several hoodies, whatever appeared to be a laptop case, several shopping bags, and at least 2 sets of keys. Danny scooped one of them up as he sat down. I know I left my spares somewhere, he said, tossing them into a sticky-looking cup holder. I looked for a seatbelt as Danny started the van, but that proved to be overly optimistic. Instead, I held on to a door handle as the van peeled out of the driveway. I realized a missed stop sign and sharp turn that sent me into the door hard enough it left a bruise. That, and I still had no idea as to where we were going. Fortunately, we ended up not going far. Danny drove to a park I thought recognized as being somewhere on the way to my mom's new job. The park was small, an old swing set and slides in front of trees that seemed to stretch on for miles behind them. I followed the other guys down a path behind the bathrooms. How far are we walking? I asked Kurt, mostly because he was nearest to me. The pavilion is just around the bend, Kurt said, pointing ahead. The pavilion came into view about 30 seconds later. It was falling apart. Pieces of the roof sat in the middle of the floor. Beams were cracked, tables were snapped in half. Almost every inch of it was covered in graffiti of some sort. I stepped in with the rest of the guys, squinting to make out some of the graffiti on the beam closest to me. Grab a seat and a beer, Danny called, sitting on a bench that looked like someone had poured red paint on it. This is the best spot in town, Chris said, with another friendly grin as he handed me a beer, because no one ever comes here but us. How'd you guys find it? I asked, probably awkwardly, as I tried to sit on the table that looked least likely to break or give me splinters through my jeans. I discovered it, Danny said, stretching back on his own table. I nodded and took a sip of beer. He hadn't really answered the question, but I didn't really care enough to ask again. For an hour or so, things were fine. I drank. I listened to the talk around me. I even joined with a few jokes and stories of my own a handful of times. More than Ethan anyway, who was still glaring at me over the top of his own beer. Overall, it was going well. I was even starting to think I could hang out with these guys from now on. I could deal with Ian's glares if it meant not spending lunch alone all senior year. Of course, if that was all that happened, I wouldn't be posting here asking for help. After about his third beer, Danny stood up on his bench. It groaned beneath his weight but didn't buckle. "It's time," Danny said. "Kurt, collect the phones." "Time for what?" I asked, watching as Noel, Chris, and Ian handed Kurt their phones. "For the fun to start," Danny said, grinning at me. "Give Kurt your phone." "If this is some sort of weird hazing thing, I'm gonna have to pass," I said, shaking my head when Kurt stepped up to me. "This isn't optional, new kid." His voice sounded sharper all at once, the light joking tone from before gone. "You rode in my van, you drank my beer, you're at my pavilion? Hand over your phone." "What the fuck?" I said as Kurt reached out quickly, catching me off guard and pulling my phone out of my hand with a quick yank. I tried to pull it back, but Kurt shoved me hard enough that I nearly fell off the table I was sitting on. "You'll get it back when we're done," Danny said, motioning for Kurt to hand him the phones. "I'm not robbing you. We just can't have phones around for this. No signals, no pictures." "Around for what?" I asked, wincing as I watched Danny set the phones directly under the red bench he was standing on. I debated whether or not I could grab it back and make a run for it, but that seemed both pointless and dramatic. First of all, given how hard Kurt had shoved me, I had no doubt I'd be stopped if I dove for my phone. Second of all, where the hell was I going to run to? There was no way I could get out of this park and back to my house on my own. "History," Danny said. I almost laughed at how ridiculous that sounded. But the look on his face told me he was serious, so I swallowed it down. "I have cracked the code to get whatever we want, whenever we want." "I keep telling you that Hannah's not going to go out with you, even if we pull this off," Noel said with a snicker. He stood up since the last time I looked at him. Chris and Ian had too, and Kurt was still standing in front of Danny's bench. So I stood too, hoping to get whatever this was over with. "Shut up, Noel," Danny said, glaring at him. "You know this isn't about her or any girls. This is about power. The power to do anything." "I believe it when I see it," Noel said, half under his breath. "Well, you're about to," Danny said, pulling a small notebook out of his pocket. "This is the night. For 3 months, I've done every ritual exactly right. We've already made contact. You all heard it. Now we finish it, and finally, meet him in the flesh." "Last time all that happened was a weird voice," Noel said. "That was the shaking," Chris pointed out. "That was intense." "Tonight we have the right sacrifice," Danny said, fixing his gaze directly on me. "Fuck. Have you ever seen someone completely drop an act in all of 10 seconds? I mean, just completely become a different person right in front of you. I'd seen it happen once before. I was 12 and this guy my mom was dating had gone from offering to buy me presents and taking me mini-golfing to screaming in my mom's face so fast that it terrified me. I never did learn the reason that guy blew up, but I also never saw him again. That had been terrifying. But when you're a kid, adults can be a little confusing and kind of scary, sometimes. This was different. Watching Danny go from joking and telling me a story about the gym teacher to talking about sacrifices and power was chilling. I probably should have seen that coming, right? I mean, I don't know how you predict something like this, but I should have known something was up. Sacrifice? I repeated, considering running again. I debated whether I had worse odds fighting all 5 of them or trying to run home without my phone to guide me. "I'll relax, new guy, conveniently born in May," Danny said, staring at me without blinking. "It's just a little bit of blood." I did turn to run at that. I made it about 3 feet before Kurt and Chris caught me, holding me back and then dragging me toward Danny. "Seriously, I'm going to pass on all of this," I attempted, trying to elbow Kurt hard enough to break free. "No," Danny said, jumping down from his bench and looking me dead in the eyes as I struggled against Kurt and Chris. "You're not." He motioned to Noel, who handed him an empty beer bottle. Danny broke it against the table and then picked up a sharp piece of glass that looked a lot like a knife. See? Danny said, pointing the piece of glass at me. The final thing I need is the blood of someone born in May. This is so fucked up, I said, trying to twist out of Kurt's iron grip on my arm again. Danny, Ian said, voice seeming to come out of nowhere. I'd honestly half forgotten he was there. It had been a good hour since he'd said anything at all. I turned my head to look over at him. As I did, I noticed that Noel hadn't moved to stand behind him, meaning I was surrounded on all sides. What? Danny said, casting Ian an annoyed look. Cut it the fuck out. This is too much, Ian said. He sounded genuinely angry about it. No, it's exactly enough to finish this, Danny returned. He looked almost smug about it. Lucas didn't sign on for this. At least the rest of us have been here from the start, Ian said, taking a few steps in toward the rest of the group. Relax, Danny said, rolling his eyes. I'm not going to kill him, I just need a little bit of blood. Yeah, but you don't know what that thing will do to him if this shit actually works, Ian said. I don't really see how that's my problem, Danny said, laughing in an unhinged sounding laugh. I stepped on Chris's foot and tried to twist away again. Instead, I got Noel's hands clamped down on my shoulders. Hard enough that it hurt. Hard enough that the stupidly large watch on his wrist dug into my skin. I don't like this. This is way too far. You've got to think this one through, Ian said. Yeah? Danny said, narrowing his eyes. I can think of a few things you'd like even fucking less, Ian. So maybe you should sit the hell down and stay out of my way. Ian didn't sit, but he didn't say anything else either. That's what I thought, Danny said before turning back to me. He twirled the shard of glass in his hand and gave me another one of those unblinking stares. Come on, don't do this, I said, still struggling. I swear I won't tell anyone you guys were up to this weird shit if you just let me go. Just let me go. Noel, shut him up, Danny said. Noel clamped a large hand over my mouth. Chris and Kurt held me still, hands on my arms even tighter than they'd been before. I tried to keep twisting away, tried to keep fighting, but it was of no use. Danny dragged the shard of glass against the skin on my forearm. The cut was deep enough that it should have been painful, but the shock of the moment overrode any pain. The world started moving in blurry slow motion. I watched in horror as Danny collected the blood onto the shard of glass and then set it carefully on the ground in front of him. Kurt, Noel, and Chris pulled back a few steps. Noel stepped away and went to join Danny, but Kurt and Chris didn't loosen the grip on me. Danny flipped the pages in his notebook, then began shouting in a language I didn't recognize. He repeated the words 6 times before the pavilion started shaking. 2 bitches clattered to the ground while Danny kept shouting. A low hissing sound that almost sounded like a voice started coming from the ground as the pavilion shook harder. Holy shit, Kurt said, watching the table split in half. This didn't happen last time, Chris said, staring at Danny, who was still repeating the words over and over. Neither of them were very focused on me. Neither of them saw Ian sneak up behind Chris and stab something into his leg. What the fuck? Chris yelled. He let go of my arm, trying to figure out how badly he was bleeding. The world snapped back to reality for me. I watched as Kurt turned around at the commotion, probably thinking it was part of the pavilion shaking until he saw Chris grabbing at his own leg and wincing. His grip on my other arm faltered. Not for long, but enough for me to twist free. Enough for Ian to grab me by the arm that wasn't bleeding and pull me away. Fucking run, Ian said. I didn't have to be told twice. Around us, the pavilion rumbled and hissed. The hiss was getting louder and sounding more like an actual voice by the second. Hey! Noel shouted, turning to see me and Ian run. I heard him call for Danny. I heard Danny shout. I heard a crack that sounded like the whole pavilion was breaking. I heard an echoing boom of a voice. I kept running. Ian and I kept running through the woods until we couldn't hear anything anymore. We stopped behind a cluster of trees, kneeling down and both trying to catch our breath. I told you not to come, Ian said after a minute, still breathing hard. I thought you just didn't like me. You didn't say Danny was a psycho planning to sacrifice me, I said, glancing down at my bleeding arm. I didn't know about the sacrifice shit, Ian said. He looked down at my arm too, and then added, you gotta wrap that so that thing can't track your blood. What is that thing? I asked, nodding, trying to figure out how to stop the bleeding. Demon. Danny swears it's his ticket to success, Ian said. He rolled his eyes at me like he'd done earlier, but this time I knew I deserved it. He shrugged out of his jacket, then pulled his t-shirt over his head. He handed me the shirt and put his jacket back on over the undershirt he was wearing. Thanks, I said, taking the shirt and wrapping it around my bleeding arm. Why the hell did you tell him your birthday? Ian asked, watching me bandage my arm like he wasn't sure I'd do it right. I didn't blame him. I didn't, I said, shaking my head. I'd been so busy trying to break away that I hadn't even thought about it, but I definitely never told him that. For a second I was confused, but then I remembered. He was in my English class. Mr. Happler wrote it on the board. Figures, Ian muttered, shaking his head. We fell silent for a few seconds. A demon, really? I asked, looking over the tree branches in front of us for any weird movements. Yeah. Danny found this weird website. I thought it was all bullshit until the first time I heard the hissing, Ian said. That's insane, I said, then, because I realized I hadn't actually said it yet, I added, thanks for all that back there. Yeah, well, Ian said, I draw the line at sacrificing random guys to demons. Sounds like a good line, I guess, I said. Ian gave me half a smile. I guess, Ian said, running a hand through his hair. So, has Danny always been... I stopped, not sure how to finish that. Crazy? Out of his fucking mind? Yes. I mean, the demon part is new, but yeah, he's like this, Ian said. I nodded. Why do you hang out with him then? I asked. I couldn't figure that part out. I suppose drawing the line at human sacrifice was valid. But from his brief conversation and that fight at the pavilion earlier, I was getting the impression that Ian didn't like Danny at all. Danny doesn't give people a choice. That's why I told you not to tell him anything, Ian said. I frowned and Ian shook his head before adding, Danny uses people's shit against them. Kurt, Noel, and Chris, he's got something on all of them. Something big. So they do whatever the hell he says. Even if it's demon sacrifices? I asked, raising my eyebrows. I'm not gonna tell anyone, but yeah, one of them buys steroids on the internet and could lose his hopes of an athletic scholarship if Danny told anyone. One of them sells test answers. One of them sells his mom's pain medications for cash, Ian said, shrugging again. What about you? I asked. Ian shot me a look that made his glare from earlier in the day look mild. Sorry, never mind, I said, shaking my head. Ian looked at me for a minute, then blew out a long breath. No, you're cool, Ian said like he was reconsidering. Guess if a demon murders us tonight, I wouldn't want fucking Danny to be the only person who knew. Besides, you at least owe me keeping a secret, right? Definitely, I agreed, nodding. I knew it wasn't any of my business, but I was curious. Ian had such a terrible reputation, but he'd also just saved my life. I couldn't put it together. Yeah, the thing is, Ian stopped and looked away from me before adding, gay. Oh, I said, not sure what to say to that. I mean, I'd had friends who weren't straight before, but no one had ever, come out to me before that way. That doesn't really seem like the same kind of thing as the other ones. Yeah? Ian asked, turning back towards me and raising an eyebrow. Tell that to my parents. Well, sorry, I said again, wincing. I shook my head, and then my eyes widened as something occurred to me. But you messed up his demon summoning thing. Does that mean he'll... I told you, I draw the line at sacrificing random guys to demons, Ian said. Shrugging, he waved a hand at the frown of my face and added, and hey, maybe the demon will get to me first, right? Okay, but I started, not sure how to finish that. Ian shook his head at me. Seriously, don't worry about it, Ian said. He turned his head away from us, scanning the trees before saying, we should go back. Oh, what? What? Why? I asked. The last fucking thing I wanted was to go back toward the pavilion. To get our phones back, or steal the van and make a break for it, whichever seems easier, Ian said, like that was somehow obvious. How? I asked. Fast and quiet, Ian said. He shook his head again, glancing over his shoulder at me. Or did you want to just stay behind these trees forever? He had a point. I was pretty sure he had a point anyway. Plus, he was clearly about 1,000,000 times better in a crisis than I was. So when he motioned to me and started walking back, I followed. I didn't remember which way we came, but Ian seemed to. I stuck close behind him until the roof of the pavilion appeared over some trees ahead. He walked slower once we saw it, making sure to stay in the shadows as much as possible. The pavilion didn't look like it was shaking anymore, and it was strangely quiet. I couldn't hear the hiss of a demon, or Danny shouting, or anything at all. I wasn't sure if that was good or not. I stepped slowly out from behind a large tree, trying to get a better view inside the pavilion. I nearly tripped when I did. I looked down, expecting to see a tree branch or root. What I saw instead was an arm. Not an arm attached to a person. Just an arm with brown-red splotches on it. An arm wearing a stupidly large watch. I bit the inside of my cheek as hard as I could to keep from screaming and nudged Ian to show him my discovery. Ian's eyes went wide and his face went pale. I couldn't blame him. For a second, we both just froze. Shock, I guess. Until a hissing sound and a whimpered no caught our attention. I looked up to see Danny suspended nearly as high as the pavilion roof. At first I thought he had somehow been flung up into a tree and was stuck. The whimpering was definitely coming from him. He was kicking his legs and flailing his arms. I craned my neck to see how he was caught, and realized he was impaled. A branch was going straight through his stomach, or I thought it was a branch, until it moved. The entire tree moved. I bit the inside of my cheek again, watching the tall, dark green and thin figure start moving. It was making a low, hissing sound. What I thought were tree branches were long arms. I watched in horror as it wrapped another one of his arms around Danny's neck. I couldn't make out its eyes or any facial features, but I could tell it was staring down at him. The demon was hissing something low and angry, sounding as it pulled Danny in closer. I pulled my eyes away when it started to twist the branch that was in his stomach. I wish I hadn't. I looked down to the ground as Danny's screams got louder, and saw more scattered bits of what had once been Noel, Kurt, and Chris. I couldn't make out much clearly in the dark, but the head I saw at the backside of the pavilion was enough. Danny's screams, protests grew louder. The hissing picked back up and the ground started to shake again, but it felt different this time. It felt like the demon was laughing. I was still trying not to scream myself when Ian tugged on my arm again. He looked like he was about to vomit, but he tugged on my arm and nodded his head toward the path we'd taken from the van. I nodded, and we bolted. The whole time we were running, I was certain we weren't going to make it to the van. I kept picturing an arm going through my chest or the demon pulling Ian's limbs off. I was sure I was about to trip and fall any minute, and that would be the end. Somehow, it wasn't. We made it to the van in one piece. Ian started it with the keys Danny had thrown into the cup holder before I'd even closed the passenger door all the way. Holy shit, Ian said. He kept repeating over and over as he drove. For several minutes, I wasn't able to say anything at all. Now what? I managed, glancing at the rear view for the demons on the road. Ian shook his head. It was only supposed to be an hour, he said. He was still shaking. What? I asked. Danny said, when the demon appears, it only stays for an hour. If we drove for an hour, it'll be gone, he said. Right, I said. I didn't know where we were driving or what we'd do if we ran out of gas or what the hell was going to happen after any of this. I didn't have the energy to think about it. I just kept seeing several body parts and hearing a hiss that sounded like a laugh. They're all fucking dead, Ian said, a mix of terror and horror in his voice, like he couldn't believe it either. Holy shit, it killed them. I didn't know what to say back to that, so I didn't say anything at all. Instead, I dug on the floor and pulled up the laptop case I'd seen earlier. There was an actual laptop in it. I opened it to find browser tabs all open to shit about rituals and summoning demons and working with monsters and other shit I wouldn't have believed was real before that night. We drove for an hour and pulled into a rest stop. We got gas and I used the rest stop Wi-Fi to map us back home on the laptop. I was pretty sure it was the only useful thing I'd done all night, but Ian thanked me for it anyway. We drove back to town in silence. What the hell do you say? Even now, it sounds crazy if I try to say anything of it. I feel crazy typing it all out. We told the police we'd been hanging out in the woods when an animal attacked us. I wasn't sure they believed us at first, but they backed off when they found the bodies, or the pieces of them. I heard a cop tell my mom no human could have done that kind of damage. It's been several months now. I thought we were in the clear. Mom makes me see a therapist once a week. I lie to him, but it's fine. I got stitches in my arm, but it's healed into a jagged scar. School started again. I sit with Ian a lot. We hang out after school too. We don't talk about it, but I know he's fucked up about it in a lot of ways. It's worse for him and me. He didn't even like Danny or the rest of those guys, but he'd hung out with them almost every day for years. Plus, my mom had been worried as hell. I don't think he's gotten as much parental help. So I think it's good we've come something like friends. We don't always have that much to say to each other in general, honestly, but after all that, who else are we going to hang out with? I thought we were in the clear, but I kept Danny's laptop after that night. Maybe that was fucked up of me, but it's not like the cops were going to investigate demons, right? And I figured his parents probably wouldn't want to know he'd been summoning weird shit either. I'd been reading all the shit he was into, the message boards and creepy as hell websites. At first it helped to know other people had seen demons, but then I saw a common thread about how demons will always hunt for the blood they were denied, about how demons don't need to be summoned if they have a target of their own. I thought it was bullshit at first. I know Danny had summoned the demon with my blood, but it's been months and nothing's happened. Besides, the demons could have just followed us that night into the woods if it wanted to, right? Except lately. There's been this weird hissing sound in my room at night. 3 nights ago, I swear the walls shook. I don't know what the hell to do. I keep debating telling Ian, but he's saved my ass enough times. I don't want to involve him again. So I'm asking Reddit instead. It's the only plan I've got. Does anyone know how to keep a demon away? Or maybe how to kill a demon? Or how to at least protect my mom? I need help fast. The hissing sound has started to sound like laughter. Alright, travelers, there you have it. That was the story about how not to make new friends. Well, I'll be here at Harrow's Edge. Give me a like, a comment, subscribe. If you want to hear more, let me know I'm doing a pretty good job. If I am, and you enjoy listening to me, I'll be here all day and all night.